Have you been able to have any reconciliation with Paul since that particular event?
He just was trying to use that situation for some personal motive that he had, and it just didn't work. But, you know, we're long past all the squabbles now.
George Harrison was known as the quiet one, the calm one, the spiritual Beatle. But behind that peaceful image was a sharp mind, strong opinions, and a list of musicians he truly couldn't stand. He rarely shouted about it, but when he spoke, his words cut deep. Some of the names will surprise you. Some were legends. Some were close to him. And one relationship hurt more than the rest. This isn't about gossip. It's about hidden tension, creative clashes, and the truth George rarely said out loud. Number 6. Neil Young. Neil Young has always been celebrated as one of rock's most honest and fearless voices, a musician who turned raw emotion into distorted confession. To fans, his shaky solos and feedback-drenched performances felt real, vulnerable, and human. But to George Harrison, that very rawness crossed a line. Where audiences heard passion, George heard chaos. He didn't see rebellion in Neil's playing, he saw a lack of discipline. To a man raised on precision, melody, and deep musical study, Neil's guitar style felt careless, like someone smashing paint onto a canvas and calling it art. George once described Neil's guitar work as a mess of distorted noise, a phrase that revealed more than simple dislike. It reflected a deeper philosophical divide about what music was supposed to be. George believed every note should serve a purpose, that even improvisation required intention and structure. Neil, by contrast, embraced mistakes, jagged edges, and emotional breakdown as part of the performance. To George, that wasn't authenticity. It was indulgence. He felt Neil used volume and distortion to hide weak technique, turning sloppiness into a personality. In private conversations, Harrison reportedly went even further, mocking Neil's solos as comic relief, suggesting that they felt more like parody than expression. George had little patience for what he saw as musicians performing chaos for applause. He came from a tradition of restraint, shaped by country picking, Indian classical music, and the idea that silence could be as powerful as sound. Watching Neil stretch 3 notes into 5 minutes of feedback felt, to George, like a rejection of musical responsibility. What bothered Harrison most wasn't just Neil's sound, but what critics celebrated about it. Throughout the 1970s, Neil Young became a symbol of artistic integrity, praised for being unpolished and emotionally exposed. George watched this from a distance with growing frustration. He once commented in an interview, without naming Neil directly, that people confuse noise with soul now. A statement that perfectly captured his discomfort with the direction rock music was heading. To George, sincerity didn't mean abandoning craft. George had spent years studying sitar under Ravi Shankar, learning that true expression came from discipline, patience, and deep understanding of tradition. Neil represented the opposite approach, instinct over education, feeling over form. George didn't dismiss emotion, but he believed emotion had to be shaped. Without structure, he felt music became self-indulgent therapy rather than meaningful art. Neil's long, broken solos felt like personal catharsis played for the audience, not a shared musical experience. Culturally, George's discomfort came from various sources as well. Neil Young was, in effect, the mascot for the consumed genius, the artist who suffered and whose imperfections were considered as the signs of depth. George was never one to romanticize that notion. Musicians, in his opinion, should be the ones to bring out the light and not be the ones to collapse under the weight. While Neil was embracing the fragility, George was searching for the transcendence. He pictured music as a tool to take people up and above themselves, not to pull them down into the mire of their emotions. To him, Neil's guitar playing was thick, unresolved, and devoid of any spiritual aspect. There was never a public confrontation from George's side towards Neil, and he seldom referred to him by name. This self-restraint was one of the characteristics of his personality. However, those who were close to him could easily identify the person he was speaking about. He didn't dislike Neil as a person, he just did not accept what Neil represented. Neil Young stood for a generation that preferred stark confession rather than beauty, shock rather than subtlety, and noise rather than nuance. George just could not relate that much to this generational phenomenon. Eventually, the conflict between George Harrison and Neil Young was not about competition or envy. It was about the two oppositely divergent music truth visions. Neil accent truth in self-exposure on the stage, while George saw it as the process of self-reigning in silence. One was acknowledging chaos as honesty, whereas the other was contending that honesty called for discipline. And in this philosophical clash, George silently concluded that Neil's guitar was not at all real freedom. It was mere noise trying to masquerade as soul. You might think that was harsh. It only gets deeper from here. Number 5. Phil Spector. Phil Spector was one of the most powerful and feared figures in the music industry. A producer whose wall of sound reshaped pop music and turned simple songs into massive emotional spectacles. To the world, he was a genius. To George Harrison, he eventually became a cautionary tale. At first, George admired Spector's ambition and trusted him with what would become the most important project of his solo career. But that trust slowly turned into regret, as George realized that Spector's vision often overwhelmed the very music he claimed to serve. When George began working on All Things Must Pass, he wanted clarity, space, and emotional honesty. The songs were deeply personal, written after years of being silenced inside the Beatles. But Spector approached them like raw material for his own sound experiments. He layered orchestras, choirs, echo, and reverb on nearly every track. Instead of an intimate confession, the album became a towering sonic monument. George later admitted that much of it sounded like mud, a blunt word that captured how buried he felt his own music had become. What frustrated George most was that Spector seemed more interested in creating a signature sound than understanding the soul of the songs. Harrison believed music should breathe, that silence and restraint were as important as power. Spector believed in total domination of the sonic space. Every emotional moment was exaggerated, every subtle phrase amplified into grand drama. To George, this wasn't enhancement, it was distortion. He felt Spector turned heartfelt songs into theatrical performances, drowning sincerity under spectacle. The situation worsened as Spector's personal behavior spiraled. He became unreliable, disappearing from sessions, showing up drunk, and leaving George alone to manage a project that had grown far beyond his control. Harrison later described feeling abandoned by the very man he trusted to guide the album. Spector had promised structure and professionalism, but delivered chaos and absence. George was left with massive tapes, confused mixes, and a growing sense that he'd lost ownership of his own work. In the following interviews, George unvarnished more and more his dissatisfaction. He confessed that if he had the opportunity and power to travel back to the time of All Things Must Pass, he would remix them. He thought the songs needed simplicity instead of orchestral overload. It was all too much, he said once, and went on to say that the emotional center of the album had been drowned in the sea of sound. For someone who held purity and spiritual depth as the highest values, Spector's maximalism was nothing but hollow and egoistic. George's resentment, however, was not only musical, but also philosophical. He thought Spector exemplified the worst kind of artistic authority, a producer who considered musicians just like instruments and not as collaborators. Harrison had already spent years battling to get his voice heard in the Beatles, and now, with his solo career, he found himself again giving up control to a dominant personality. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had broken out of one creative prison only to step into another. As Spector's later years took a darker turn with incidents of violence, paranoia, and eventually slaying, George's sentiment towards the former turned into a silent disapproval. He never denounced Spector's character openly, but there was a change in his demeanor. He no longer spoke of Spector with respect, and instead called him a person who had lost contact with the real world. For George, Spector's brilliance was together with his madness, one affecting the other, and so the madness was in the music done together. Eventually, Phil Spector was to become one of the very few collaborators that George Harrison absolutely regretted placing his trust in. He didn't exactly conventionally loathe Spector, but he strongly resented what Spector had done to his most intimate piece of art. The Wall of Sound, which was once praised as highly innovative, became a representation of artistic strangulation. And perhaps the most bitter fact was that George had found his voice at last. But it was then, unfortunately, that it got submerged under someone else's remix. Number 4. Paul McCartney. Paul McCartney was never George Harrison's enemy, but he was often his greatest source of frustration. Inside the Beatles, Paul naturally became the leader, the one with endless energy, endless ideas, and an unstoppable drive to shape every detail of the music. He was organized, ambitious, and constantly thinking about how to make songs tighter, catchier, and more successful. George admired Paul's talent deeply, but over time, that admiration slowly turned into quiet resentment. George felt that no matter how hard he worked, he was always standing in Paul's shadow, treated more like a supporting player than an equal creative voice. In the early years, George accepted his role without complaint. He was younger, less confident, and surrounded by two dominant personalities in John and Paul. At first, it made sense to follow their lead, but as his songwriting matured, the imbalance became painful. George began bringing in songs that were deeply personal and musically sophisticated, only to watch Paul reshape them in the studio. He once admitted that Paul would often "show me how it should go," a phrase that revealed how belittled he felt. Instead of collaboration, it felt like correction, as if George's ideas were raw drafts that needed Paul's approval to exist. As a guitarist, George felt particularly constrained by Paul's perfectionism. Paul had a habit of playing or suggesting parts for everyone, even when they weren't asked. His bass lines became increasingly complex, his piano parts more prominent, and his ideas more intrusive. George later said that Paul's busy playing left no room for him to breathe musically. He felt suffocated by arrangements that were already crowded before his guitar even entered the picture. Every space felt filled, every decision already made. This dynamic slowly eroded George's confidence. Despite being one of the most famous guitarists in the world, he began doubting his own abilities. He once confessed that working with Paul made him feel inadequate as a guitarist, a shocking admission from someone who had shaped the sound of an entire generation. The problem wasn't skill, it was space. George felt he was never given the time or respect needed to fully develop his ideas inside the band. He wasn't failing, he was being limited. The tension peaked during the recording of "Let It Be," when cameras captured George openly confronting Paul. "I'll play whatever you want me to play," George said coldly, "or I won't play at all." That moment revealed years of bottled frustration. It wasn't about one argument or one song. It was about feeling creatively invisible. George had reached a point where he no longer felt like a band member, but an employee, someone hired to execute ideas rather than contribute them. What made the situation more painful was that Paul didn't see himself as controlling. In his mind, he was simply trying to make the music better. He believed in structure, discipline, and pushing people to do their best. But to George, that mindset ignored the emotional reality of collaboration. George wanted trust, not instruction. He wanted space, not supervision. He believed that music should evolve organically, not be engineered by one dominant personality. Paul's relentless involvement felt less like leadership and more like quiet domination. There was also an emotional imbalance in how their personalities clashed. Paul was energetic, vocal, and constantly engaged. George was more introverted, reflective, and inward-looking. Paul filled the silence with ideas. George needed silence to create. The more Paul talked, the more George retreated. Over time, George learned that speaking up often led to being overruled, so he simply stopped trying. That silence wasn't peace, it was resignation. After the Beatles broke up, George finally experienced creative freedom for the first time. He released All Things Must Pass and proved that he had years of suppressed material. The album was massive, both critically and commercially. The success was bittersweet. It confirmed what George had always suspected. He had been sitting on a mountain of ideas that never had room to grow inside the band. Paul hadn't destroyed his creativity, but he had undeniably restricted it. In the end, George didn't hate Paul as a person. Their relationship remained complex, full of history, affection, and unresolved tension. They shared memories, jokes, and a bond no one else could understand. But George never fully escaped the emotional scars of feeling overshadowed. Paul represented the life George lived inside the Beatles, a life of compromise, silence, and unfulfilled potential. And while George found peace later in life, the shadow of Paul's control remained one of the deepest frustrations he ever carried. That was conflict from the inside. The next one comes from someone he truly trusted. Number 3. Eric Clapton. Eric Clapton was one of the few guitarists George Harrison truly admired, a musician whose tone, phrasing, and emotional restraint felt deeply connected to George's own sensibilities. When Clapton first emerged in the 1960s, George saw him as a master of feel, someone who could say more with a single bend than others could with a flurry of notes. Their friendship grew naturally, built on mutual respect, shared influences, and a belief that the guitar should serve emotion rather than ego. For a long time, Clapton was one of the only players George genuinely trusted. In those early years, Clapton represented everything George valued in music. His playing wasn't about speed or flash, but about space, timing, and subtle expression. George admired how Clapton could let a note breathe, how he avoided unnecessary complexity. To George, Clapton felt honest in a way many guitarists weren't. There was no need to impress, no need to dominate, just feeling, tone, and restraint. That approach aligned perfectly with George's own evolving philosophy about music as a form of communication, not competition. But over the years, admiration slowly turned into quiet disappointment. George began to feel that Clapton had stopped evolving. While the world continued to celebrate Eric as a blues legend, George felt he was watching a talented musician become trapped inside his own past. He once joked privately that Clapton had been playing the same solo since 1968. a line that carried both affection and criticism. To George, Clapton's refusal to change felt less like loyalty to tradition and more like creative stagnation. George had always believed that music should be a journey, not a museum. He constantly searched for new sounds, exploring Indian classical music, synthesizers, ambient textures, and spiritual themes that pushed him far beyond traditional rock. Clapton, by contrast, remained rooted in blues, endlessly returning to the same emotional vocabulary. George didn't dismiss the blues, but he felt that Clapton used it as a safe space, a place where he no longer needed to take risks or confront new ideas. This difference in philosophy created a subtle but undeniable distance between them. Clapton's playing became more polished, more controlled, and more predictable, while George sought imperfection, atmosphere, and spiritual depth. George once remarked that many guitarists spent their lives polishing old licks instead of discovering new ones, a comment widely interpreted as being aimed at Clapton. It wasn't a public attack, but it revealed how far their artistic paths had drifted. What made George the angriest was that Clapton appeared to be happy just living in the past. He saw fans who should probably not be so worshipful if they were already tuning into Eric for the sounds of past decades, and he thought that it was strange that no one considered legends to have been the ones who could never be the best artists. George would say that no one else but legends could be the ones to always come up with new stories, but not to tell them the same way through the mediums that everyone else did. He admired Clapton's great skill, but he thought that being a good technician had replaced the artist's ever-burning desire to discover. The music coming from Clapton was, on one hand, very sincere to George, but on the other, very frozen in the spirit of not searching for anything new, and hence the death of the artist. Besides, there was a stronger emotional factor behind George's disappointment. Clapton had given up his place in George's life. At one time, he was part of George's inner circle, a musician whom George trusted not just as a professional, but also as a person. The bond of friendship between the two had endured love triangles, personal struggles, and decades of staying friends. Nevertheless, George felt that Eric had become a routine man who no longer challenged himself or his surroundings. He was not on a quest for new significance, but just polishing the old memories. For a man as spiritually restless as George, that was equivalent to quiet surrender. George gave Clapton no hostility and no public criticism at any point in their lives. Even when he was clearly disappointed, he was gentle and made quite a lot of the whole situation. From that time on, Clapton still got the praise for his sound, still got the title of one of the greatest field players in history, but the edge had gone. The fire that used to bind them together had cooled off into very polite respect. George was looking at Clapton as a thing of the past, but not as a talent of the present. There was no fighting, no bitterness, just a feeling of emotional distance that was impossible to overcome. Ultimately, George Harrison didn't dislike Eric Clapton, but rather, he outgrew him. Clapton had become a representative of the guitar world that George had left behind, which was a world based on tradition rather than transformation. In fact, it was the very same world that George had rejected. For George, it was the very same thing that happened with Clapton. The talent stopped evolving. Not a failure, not a betrayal, just a quiet stagnation, the kind that hurts the most since it comes from a person you once thought would keep growing along with you. Number 2. Jimmy Page. Jimmy Page was the embodiment of rock excess. His image was larger than life, his solos endless, his stage presence soaked in mysticism and volume. To millions, Page was a guitar god. To George Harrison, he represented everything that had gone wrong with modern rock. Where Page chased spectacle, George sought meaning. Where Page pushed louder, faster, and heavier, George leaned toward restraint, space, and emotional clarity. From George's perspective, Page wasn't evolving music, he was inflating it. George once joked that Led Zeppelin songs felt like wanking with guitars, a crude phrase that revealed genuine frustration. He believed Page treated the guitar like an athletic competition rather than a spiritual instrument. To George, endless solos weren't expressions of soul. They were expressions of ego. He felt Page used complexity and volume to dominate attention, turning music into performance rather than communication. The louder Page became, the more distant George felt from that entire world. What bothered George most was how celebrated this excess became. Critics praised Zeppelin for their power and virtuosity, while George saw repetition disguised as innovation. He believed Page recycled old blues riffs, amplified them, and called it originality. George respected technique, but he didn't worship it. He felt Page's obsession with technical display left little room for subtlety, silence, or emotional nuance. To George, Page's music felt physically impressive, but spiritually empty. George had spent years studying Indian philosophy, where music was meant to elevate consciousness. In that worldview, sound was sacred, not something to be abused for spectacle. Page's interest in occult imagery and dark mysticism unsettled George. While Page flirted with demons, George searched for transcendence. One looked outward for power. The other looked inward for peace. Their artistic paths weren't just different. They were philosophically incompatible. George also disliked how Page treated musical history. He felt Zeppelin borrowed heavily from blues musicians without honoring the roots properly. To George, respect for tradition didn't mean copying it loudly. It meant transforming it with humility. He believed Page's reinterpretations lacked acknowledgement and depth, turning cultural heritage into commercial bombast. This wasn't just a musical issue for George, it was a moral one. There was also a personal element beneath the criticism. George had grown tired of the guitar hero culture that Page symbolized. He didn't want to compete for loudest solo or longest riff. He wanted music to heal, not impress. Watching Page dominate stadiums reinforced everything George was trying to escape. Fame had already drained him once, and Page's world felt like fame taken to its most bloated extreme. Despite his criticism, George never denied Page's talent. He recognized his technical skill and influence, but he saw that influence as dangerous, creating generations of guitarists obsessed with speed, distortion, and dominance. To George, Page helped turn the guitar into a weapon instead of a voice. Music became about conquest rather than connection. In the end, George Harrison didn't hate Jimmy Page as a person. He rejected what Page symbolized: excess without purpose, power without humility, noise without transcendence. Page represented the rock world George walked away from, the world of endless solos and endless ego. And in turning his back on that world, George quietly chose a different path, one where the guitar wasn't meant to conquer the audience, but to gently guide them somewhere deeper. You've seen the musical side, now get ready for the emotional one. Number 1 cuts the deepest. Number 1, John Lennon. John Lennon was never just a bandmate to George Harrison. He was a mentor, an older brother, and in many ways the emotional center of George's early life. When George joined the Beatles, he was still a teenager, insecure and eager to learn, surrounded by older, louder personalities. John was charismatic, sharp-tongued, and already confident in his identity as a rebel and leader. George admired him deeply, not just as a musician, but as a symbol of freedom, wit, and fearlessness. But that admiration slowly became painful because John rarely treated George as an equal. In the early years, John often dismissed George's ideas with sarcasm or silence. He mocked George's songwriting, joked about his guitar parts, and rarely encouraged him creatively. George once admitted that John never really took me seriously, a quiet confession that revealed years of emotional frustration. While John and Paul dominated the band's direction, making most of the decisions and shaping the sound, George felt trapped in the role of the junior partner, expected to contribute but rarely trusted to lead. No matter how hard he worked, he remained the third one. As George matured, the gap became harder to ignore. His musical taste expanded beyond rock into Indian classical music, spiritual philosophy, and deeper emotional themes. He wanted to explore new sounds, new meanings, and new identities. But John wasn't interested in that evolution. He saw George's interest as strange, impractical, or unnecessary, often teasing him for his spiritual pursuits. To John, George's search for inner peace seemed distant from the raw, confrontational energy he valued. George felt misunderstood, as if the person he once idolized no longer cared to understand who he had become. The emotional wound wasn't just professional. It was deeply personal. John had a habit of using humor as a weapon, and George often found himself on the receiving end. Jokes about his songs, his faith, or his personality chipped away at his confidence over time. George once reflected that John could be very cruel without realizing it, a line that revealed how deeply those comments stayed with him. The laughter masked a pattern of emotional dominance, where John's words carried power, and George's feelings were left unspoken. By the late 1960s, George began to withdraw. He spoke less in the studio, brought fewer ideas, and emotionally checked out of conversations that once mattered to him. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he no longer believed he would be heard. John's dismissive attitude had taught him that speaking up was pointless. George once said that he learned to stop caring, not out of peace, but out of exhaustion. It was easier to stay silent than to keep fighting for recognition that never came. It is rather ironic that George's finest accomplishments came to light only after he completely stopped looking for John's approval. With the dissolution of the Beatles, George set free all the creativity that was stored in him already through the album All Things Must Pass. The album was an incredible hit, and it was packed with the tunes that could not find their spots in the band. Still, the victory was bittersweet. It confirmed the fact that George had a very strong voice all along, but it also brought to the forefront how long that voice had been muffled. John never witnessed that full-blown independence of George's, and the latter bore the unresolved strain silently. The emotional gap continued to exist even after the separation of the band. The distance between George and John sometimes lessened, but their relationship was never again as intimate as it had been in the very beginning years. George's love for John was still there, but something very basic had been ruptured. He did not regard John as a hero anymore, but merely as a complex human being who had both influenced and restricted him. There was still respect, but innocence was lost. George publicly criticized John very seldom after John's passing. Still, the suffering was there, under the skin. He later confessed in interviews to having fighting emotions, love mixed with bitterness. John had crafted, rejuvenated, and at the same time hurt himself. The bond was too intricate for mere tags. It wasn't hate, but it wasn't tranquility either. It was unfinished, unresolved, and emotionally heavy. In the end, John Lennon became the deepest emotional scar in George Harrison's life. Not because of competition, but because of a connection that was lost. George never stopped loving John, but he never forgot how small John made him feel. And sometimes, those who have the greatest impact on us are, at the same time, the ones who hurt us the most. George Harrison never chased drama, but his honesty revealed a side few people ever saw. Behind the calm voice and gentle image was a man who cared deeply about music, truth, and creative freedom. These weren't just dislikes. They were reflections of what George stood for and what he refused to become. If you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories like this. And don't forget to click on the next video on your screen for another fascinating journey into music history.